Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
In a way, as the theologian steps back or tries to view what's going on in the world, we begin to say that we must mount a critique of science. So from our theological viewpoint, we can't just sit on the sidelines and say, oh, good, let the scientists do whatever they want. Let just scientific experimentation go on. Let's just see where it all goes. We begin to think, no, somebody's got to think critically about this stuff. Somebody's got to be able to critique what is going on here. Somebody's got to be able to say, hey, this is a faulty direction, or we need a moral sense in dealing with this particular problem.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Tom Hadley, a physician from Fremont. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of science as a source of mystery. Here's Father Bacik.
Tom, I asked you to come on the program not just because you happen to be a medical doctor, but also a friend of mine, and because we have had a number of interesting conversations over the years, and I thought it would be good if we could speak some more about serious matters. I have in mind questions of religion and science. Are you game for that?
Well, yes, I wish to be on your program. In fact, I realize I forced my way onto your program, basically because I represent the local chapter of the Word and Edgewise Foundation, whose main crusade this month is malignant monologues. And you have been targeted as the chief offender in the area, known to ramble on for entire radio programs. So I'm here as a representative of that organization to speak my mind on whatever may come up, and if science and religion is what you want me to talk about, I'm quite adept at that.
Well, I would like to launch into that topic. I've been afraid that I would get attacked by your organization. Some people have said that I don't let other people say anything on the program. But that is not true. I give a lot of opportunity for people to talk. I pause often, and so I don't think that I really ought to be indicted by your particular organization. But however, I want to carry on now with this question of religion and science, and I don't want you to say anything for about the next 5 minutes while I set this topic.
Yes, Hamlet.
Because it seems to me that we have a problem here between science and religion. And at least in many people's minds, there ends up being a conflict between those two things. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way science has developed over the years. Because science in one way or another has been successful. The scientific method has ended up producing results. And this catches people's attention and ends up making people think that really science as a whole would be able to solve all of our problems. So we began to think of our great human problems of poverty and hunger, the disease and so on. I think there was the general sense that, we now know how to attack those things. Now, through the scientific method, we can eradicate all of these troubles. In the scientist's mind, I think it was largely this, that the real problems that plague us human beings, these problems are largely external ones. They're outside of our own psyche, our own mental processes. And so it said we've got these external problems of feeding people, clothing people, keeping people properly sheltered and so on, distributing food around the world, trying to control disease, learn how to respond to the crises created by nature and so on, and that science is perfectly equipped to do this. So science is then able to give us a sort of an efficient means of dealing with these problems. Science tells us that you have to investigate, you have to do your empirical work, you come up with an hypothesis, you're able to test that hypothesis, then you find out how to reduplicate this effort, to spread it around the world. And then you have the whole business of creating bureaucracies or efficient systems for using this scientific method. And I think that in people's minds there was this presupposition that indeed, yes, we can create a more humane life for ourselves through this use of science. Now, this science then produces what we know as technology, and the whole technological world results from that. All the gadgetry that we know, the communication systems that we enjoy, television, radio, the whole factory system that we know through the Industrial Revolution and so on, all means of harnessing what we know from the world of science into the world of technology so as to improve our human lot. Now, I think that what happens is that this optimistic viewpoint, somehow or another, has begun to fail. In other words, there's the sense that, well, science is not doing all of the job that it ought to be doing. As a matter of fact, instead of just improving the world, now we begin to sense that science somehow is creating a worse situation. So we might just think of the pollution area, for example. So we have this industrial revolution, we find how to produce more things, but what happens? We are then fouling our atmosphere. We're creating a situation, in fact, where if we keep, as some claim, heating up this whole world of ours, that indeed we will ruin our own environment for human living. And so the whole scientific method begins to be called into question because it produces pollution. It also produces things like nuclear weaponry. So now we can produce atomic weapons. We can now, for the first time in history, destroy ourselves. Now we can blow up our whole world. What gave us that capability? The world of science. So pure science enables us finally to come up with the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, nuclear warfare, and here we are now living under the threat of this bomb. And again, what is happening? Some people are saying, well, science, which we thought was going to save us in one way or another, is now producing this kind of threat. And another thing that comes to my mind is in terms of this whole bureaucracy and this efficient system that is set up to deliver products. We get this factory system. And what happens to human beings in this? Very often they end up feeling like ciphers, that they're not important, they're robbed of their dignity, no opportunity for creativity and so on. So what do we have again? This scientific method and its resulting technology begin to be called into question. Really, can we be as optimistic as we once were? So I think, in a way, as the theologian steps back or tries to view what's going on in the world, we begin to say that we must mount a critique of science. So from our theological viewpoint, we can't just sit on the sidelines and say, oh, good, let the scientists do whatever they want. Let just scientific experimentation go on. Let's just see where it all goes. We begin to think, no, somebody's got to think critically about this stuff. Somebody's got to be able to critique what is going on here. Somebody's got to be able to say, hey, this is a faulty direction, or we need a moral sense in dealing with this particular problem. So I think that perhaps that may set the stage and no doubt disproves the charge of your particular organization that I babble on and don't allow others to talk. But anyway, now it is your turn.
Well, I think a few points come up. First, I believe that there's a misperception about science's powers. The public looks at science as the panacea. If science can't solve it, then who can? I think this is an attitude that, at least in my life, we've grown up with, that science can solve all problems. I think for people working in the world of science, it's a much different attitude. And I think you have to separate the world of science out basically from the pure science approach to the technological spin-off group of scientists who who serve either the needs of a government or needs of a corporation or whatever to produce products to sell to keep a system moving.
So you're suggesting that the pure scientists, the people doing the original research in that, might have loftier motivations or bigger perspectives on the whole thing?
Well, I think that when we started about talking about science, we ought to define what are we talking about and what is this thing science? Science basically is a human activity, and it's probably its source is something that's common to all people. The source is curiosity. I don't think the initial source is gaining power over nature as much as finding out about things. Men ask questions. It's a part of the human quality and will be there as long as man is man. And the pure scientist is one who asks questions, sometimes very simple, unanticipated questions about nature or about what lies before him, and sometimes comes to startling conclusions about the nature of things. The real problem with science then begins when conclusions are made about nature that can be put into practical material use. And here, I think the pure scientists struggle the most with the great ethical problems. If you read any of the works of Oppenheimer, any of the people involved with the production of the atomic bomb, for example, most of them struggled desperately in their hearts and souls to justify this, because I think there's a tremendous momentum that's built up in a scientist when he's on the verge of a discovery, and nothing is going to stop him from discovering something that later on might turn into a source of danger for mankind. I think, though, that to get back to the issue, we all have a faith in science, maybe because we live generally in a material atmosphere, and we don't look for answers from religion, at least in a public way. You know, the evening news doesn't broadcast what possibly God may think about the issues at hand. If we have a material set in our minds, we look to a material functioning thing like science. Science deals with matter. Science is trying to tell us how to do things. Science will uncover the mysteries. And I think for anyone in science, they look and say, we can't meet your demands. We can't solve all the problems of the world because some of the problems are out of our grasp, just like some of the basic questions you might ask about the universe we have found are somehow just beyond our grasp.
Tom, let me comment a bit on that materialism. I think that's in what you were saying there. I mean, there is the notion that we begin by looking at the world as simply a material entity. And I think that when you begin to think in those terms, that maybe perhaps the ball game is already lost at that point. Because from the theological viewpoint, it's always a question of, well, where could I insert spirit? Or where can I bring in the element of mystery? When I begin with just looking at this hard world of ours and figuring that everything can be managed or controlled or measured or weighed, or everything that's worthwhile can somehow be logically deduced. I think if you begin there, from my theological viewpoint anyway, that you're always then faced with the idea that spirit seems to be alien. Spirit is then foreign. You're always on, as a theologian, you're on a defensive all the time, like where can I bring God in? Or where can I start talking about my religious values? Or where does the world of spirit start? And I think that what is needed, in a sense, is sort of a revolution at that point, that we would begin by knowing the material world and the world of spirit by looking at ourselves first. This has been one of my quarrels of what has happened in modern times with science. It seems to me that scientific method invaded even the world of psychology, for example, or philosophical anthropology, that very study of what we humans are all about. And you end up with somebody like B.F. Skinner saying that, well, man is nothing more than a bundle of responses to external stimuli. What was it Skinner said one time? That man is more like Pavlov's dogs than Hamlet's angels. I mean, it's a question of trying to figure out what the starting point is for looking at what is real in our world. And I suggest that when we begin looking at ourselves and trying to reflect on who we are, we begin to get the best fix on what matter and spirit are all about. Because when I start there, I don't begin with myself as an object that I'm going to measure or weigh. I begin with my personal reactions to the world. I begin with reflection on who I am, and when I start to do that, I see things like, well, I've got infinite longings. Well, I'm never satisfied with what I have. Well, I have the ability to step back from my world and analyze it. I can detach from what's going on and sort of view it as an observer. I can withdraw into myself in a sort of reflection or meditation. I find myself reaching out and grasping for things that I can never get hold of. I come to know myself as rather as a mystery, as something that is fundamentally unexplainable. And I think that's where I would begin to locate this whole world of spirit. That's where I know that the world has got something more going on in it than what can be measured. When I think of my reactions to a concert, of how we might analyze human love, of how I would explain my freedom, I know that I am more than a bundle of responses to stimuli. At the same time, I think that's how we end up knowing matter. I know matter insofar as I'm limited, as I'm tied down to one place, as my body gets tired, fatigued, in which I can't do all the things that I would like to do. My experiences are limited. And I begin to know matter, I think, as a limiting principle. Well, what I'm trying to respond to is to undercut the old-time scientific method right at its roots and say this idea of starting out by saying, hey, I'm going to look around and measure all this matter in my world, including me or us human beings, I think we're off the track right away. So as a theologian, I want to get in there quickly and say, no, wrong starting point. Start with ourselves. Start with what we know about the human reality. Get a little bit of self-reflection into the equation early on. And I think we will then find that reality is a lot more mysterious than the strict empiricists or materialists lead us to believe.
I'm not sure you even have to start with that. I think if you still look at matter, you're going to find that you're going to arrive at the same feeling of mystery, ultimately. It's really been done in the world of science. With Isaac Newton, most people felt at his time and for the few centuries afterwards that you could probably measure everything in the universe and predict the future. Everything was quantifiable. The world was as we saw it. Measuring became the basis for understanding reality. That worked up till fine until Einstein came along, and then the quantum physicists began their work, and suddenly they found that they reached a border with matter. They found that you could only go so far in investigating matter before suddenly there was a mystery there. They couldn't get past defining what is the basic element of matter, what is the basic element of the universe. If we could just find that one thing, we would be able to say this is what reality is at its most fundamental level. They found that they can't get past a certain depth in matter. They found that the atom was composed of subatomic particles. They found that they could not measure where these subatomic particles were or where they were going without somehow disturbing the measurement. So suddenly the scientist who was measuring gets involved in the process of the measurement. And there's no ability to say fundamentally what lies before man. So there's a border there, a mysterious edge, which the leading edge of science is always butting up against and riding into mystery.
Tom, when you're talking about that, I was thinking of Einstein, and he did have that sense of mystery of the universe, didn't he? He had that sense, he had that idea that human reason had to be humble in the face of a reality that was ultimately unexplainable or inexhaustible for us. And I think maybe many people look up to Einstein. Maybe he would be a representative figure here for what you're saying. That maybe those of us who are laymen in the field of science end up probably taking our models from the 19th century or from the other older viewpoint that said that science could control everything by measuring everything and only the empirically verifiable was real. I have the impression as you're talking that really the advanced scientists saw it and see it differently, that they have more room in their understanding for this mysterious element. And I'm thinking Einstein here is probably a very good example, although he did not believe in a personal God. He did certainly have this wonderful sense of awe and mystery about the whole of our universe.
And his fundamental theories of special relativity opened up new realities that were, to the common sense, nonsense. If you look at what Einstein says about what happens at the speed of light, it has no bearing on your experience. But we know through some of the preliminary testings of his theory that the universe seems to operate in a way that's contradictory to what we would expect it to be. And Einstein, who to most would probably be the symbol of the most demanding, exacting scientist, the genius who could figure out everything, suddenly he becomes the man who brings you the gift of a new reality that would be impossible to even predict. To say, oh, if you went and said the universe operates like this, where at the speed of light your body thins out, time slows down, everyone would, in the 19th century, would look at you and say, that's ridiculous. Suddenly Einstein brings you a whole new world, as mysterious as anything that might have come out of a pulpit in the 19th century about fire and brimstone. So I think that many people are still strapped with an old image of the scientist as a man who's in the laboratory who in a cold-hearted way figures out something without emotion and tells you the answer to a mystery and then robs you of that emotion of mystery. I think most scientists today will give you the gift of awe.
I liked what you said, too, about the Heisenberg principle, that what it does is get that subjective element in there, which I was trying to introduce from the theological or philosophical side, that we had to understand our own role in perceiving the world and take seriously our own contribution and so on, look at ourselves in relationship to our world. And so I guess Heisenberg would remind us that the very experimenter is involved in the experiment, that he's not a neutral observer, but begins to influence the world and influence the experiment. So I think that what's interesting to me is that science ends up generating its own critique, doesn't it? In other words, science itself can't remain as reductionist as it might have been at one time. By that I mean it can't rule out all of this larger question of what the human reality and the physical world is all about. Can't reduce it to what is empirically verifiable. So science runs up against its own limits that way. I remember reading one scientific work which had the phrase in it that a man cannot live by bread alone. The scientist was allowing himself to be poetic and allowing his subjective side to come out again. But I mean, it was this idea that there's more to the human spirit than originally meets the eye.
And I think that you'll find, if you read some of the scientific works, for example, a man named Mach was one of the mentors of Einstein. And what Mach said is that science must use its discoveries as tools, and those tools that wear out or are found to be defective are thrown away. I think what science suffers is what most human institutions and human activities suffer, that there's always a tendency to dogmatize, to solidify, and to lay down traditions that people feel reluctant to attack when other information suggests that a new viewpoint is required. So I think the best of scientists have a critiquing ability inherent in their mindset, and that they're always open to the fact that maybe what they believed and cherished is wrong ultimately. And there, again, lies a chance for mystery. I don't think any scientist worthy of the term scientist would play down mystery. They don't feel they can explain the entire universe.
Yes. Again, I guess from the theological viewpoint, that what we would want to happen is that religion would play a role in answering these great questions in life. It's something like this, that if the scientist moves out of his laboratory and into the world of philosophical and theological debate, he has to play by the rules of that game. It's like Wittgenstein reminded us that there are various language games that are around. There's various worlds of discourse. And the scientist, when he moves off into the world of meaning and purpose and large ways of looking at our world, then he begins to play the language game of the philosopher and the theologian. And I think that's why many of us would be critical of the popular scientists who carry more weight than they ought to when they move into this world. One might think of Carl Sagan, who does such a wonderful job of popularizing science and so on, and who I think is a man with a religious sense and who has written that really there is this question of mystery and awe and so on. I think he takes an agnostic position on the question of God, but here I think that we shouldn't give him the role of theologian. I mean, that he is a theological agnostic doesn't really carry a lot of weight, I don't think. In other words, he's great in his field, but when he moves out of his field, then he ought to be in touch with a long philosophical, theological tradition which has wrestled with this question of the existence of God. He's only as good as the arguments that he brings to that area. And so I guess we in the theological world are always looking for the debate to be enlarged and for the empirical method not to be the last word that's said about our world. In other words, we keep saying that no, life is bigger than that. No, we have to investigate whether this world of ours is absurd or has some sort of ultimate meaning. We have to investigate the claims of the religious traditions to see if they would help us to live more humanly. We get back to the critique I tried to mount at the beginning of science, that science in many ways has failed us. In other words, the scientific method has been used in a way that has damaged the human. And so I go back to that idea of pollution and the ability to destroy ourselves now, and the kind of bureaucratic mess that we get into that reduces individuals to a cipher in some way. So I think that has to be criticized by the theologian. We'd want to say that we need a moral voice there when we try to talk about nuclear energy or whether atomic weaponry is going to be used. We have to have somebody around who says, hey, wait a second, is this good for the whole human picture or not? Is this good for our race and our globe? Does this make sense in any sort of larger perspective? So in the theological world, we want to be in a position of having a larger vision than the ordinary scientist would have. We want to be able to say, hey, this is good. We celebrate this. We don't want to turn the clock back. We don't want to get rid of science. We don't want to hold people in the laboratory down. We say, let's go with it and let's get on, and the Christian ought to be more passionate about the scientific enterprise and so on. But at the same time, we want to be in a position to critique it and say, let's figure out a way to control pollution, to control nuclear weaponry, to try to enhance this globe of ours so people can live more humanly. And perhaps that's where the dialogue could continue between science and religion.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Tom Hadley, a physician from Fremont. The topic of this week's reflections was science as a source of mystery. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner.